The morning sun spilt over the cracked sidewalks of Birmingham, Alabama, warming the small house where Henry Thompson had lived for over 40 years. At 73, Henry was not a man who moved quickly, but his steps were steady, his back still straight. He had worked most of his life in a steel mill, his hands calloused, his voice quiet, his presence dignified. Everyone in the neighborhood respected him. He was the kind of man who raised his children with discipline, prayed before every meal, and still gave advice to teenagers on the corner who thought nobody listened. That morning, Henry put on a faded blue shirt and iron khakis, his good clothes. He was heading to the bank, a routine he had followed for decades. Each month, after his pension check cleared, he withdrew cash for his expenses. He was old-fashioned like that. He trusted bills in his pocket more than numbers on a screen. The tellers knew him by name. They greeted him with warm smiles. He always carried his money carefully, folded inside a leather wallet his late wife had given him on their 20th anniversary. But what Henry did not know that morning was that his errand, so ordinary and humble, was about to draw him into a storm. He was about to become the target of a man who wore a badge but had long since betrayed the oath behind it. Officer Derek Walsh had been on the Birmingham police force for 12 years. On paper, he was a decorated officer, praised for his arrests and his toughness on crime. In reality, he was a predator cloaked in authority. He had learnt to manipulate situations, to target those least likely to be believed, and to turn his badge into a weapon against the very people he was meant to serve. And Derek carried with him something more poisonous than greed, an unshakable disdain for black men he saw as less than himself. The two men's paths crossed just after Henry left the bank. Derek spotted him walking with a slow, careful gait, his wallet bulging just slight. That evening, Derek Walsh sat in a corner booth at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. His uniform was gone, replaced with a leather jacket and jeans. But the swagger remained, the same crooked grin that had unnerved so many of his victims. He pulled a stack of bills from his pocket, leafing through them one by one. He didn't know that each bill carried a silent signature invisible to the eye, a trail that would lead directly back to him. To Derek, it was just easy money. Another day, another nobody who wouldn't dare speak up. He had convinced himself that men like Henry had no voice, no power, no chance against a white officer's word. The arrogance blinded him, as it had for years. Meanwhile, in a federal office downtown, a team of FBI agents gathered around a monitor. Special Agent Carla Jennings, sharp-eyed and relentless, led the task force investigating misconduct in Birmingham's police department. She had heard enough whispers about Walsh to know he wasn't just rough around the edges. He was dangerous. Target confirmed, one of her agents reported. He made contact with the subject today. Pension cash withdrawn. The bills were switched out as planned. Jennings nodded. Good. Now we follow the money. He thinks he's safe because his victims are vulnerable. But arrogance is always the crack in the armor. For Henry, the night was restless. He sat in his living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He replayed the encounter again and again, every detail seared into his memory. The officer's smirk, the roughness of his hand, the way his words stripped Henry of dignity. He thought of his children, now grown, who had moved away to carve out lives of their own. He thought of his grandchildren and the lessons he always tried to teach them. Respect yourself, respect others, and keep your head high even when the world tries to bow it down. But how could he teach pride when, even in old age, he could be treated as less than human? The courtroom was heavy with silence that morning, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the skin. Journalists packed the benches, their pens and cameras ready. Community members filled the back rows, some with folded arms, others with eyes full of anticipation. For months, whispers of corruption had haunted Birmingham, and now the truth was on trial. At the defense table sat Derek Walsh, his once proud shoulders slumped slightly. The arrogance hadn't fully disappeared, but it was cracked, like a mask splitting under pressure. He wore a navy suit that seemed ill-fitting, his tie loose at the collar. His eyes darted occasionally toward the gallery, where uniformed officers had come to watch, not all in support, some out of morbid curiosity. Across from him, the prosecution's table held Special Agent Carla Jennings and the federal attorneys. Their files were stacked neatly, evidence meticulously organized. Among that evidence were the marked bills, each one a silent witness to Derek's crimes. And in the witness room, Henry Thompson sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. At 73, he had never imagined his life would bring him here. The courthouse had always been a place of distance, somewhere he avoided unless duty called. Yet today, he was not just a bystander. He was a voice for truth. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the pattern of abuse. For years, the attorney declared, his voice firm, Officer Derek Walsh used his badge not to protect, but to prey. He robbed those he swore to serve. He chose victims he believed powerless. Elderly black men, young black drivers, those he thought society would not listen to. But today, the silence ends. Derek's attorney countered with a different story. My client is a decorated officer. He has put his life on the line countless times for this community. These so-called marked bills are A. The day after the guilty verdict, Birmingham felt different. The air still carried tension, but also something else, something lighter, as though the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Newspapers ran headlines that shouted across the front pages. Officer found guilty of robbing elderly black man, and justice at last in corruption case. Henry Thompson woke early that morning, as he always did. His body, trained by decades of rising with the sun, stirred before the first light touched his curtains. But that morning, the weight that had pressed against his chest for months was lighter. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the paper spread before him. His face was on the front page, captured mid-testimony, his eyes steady and his voice caught in a moment of truth. His grandchildren chattered around him, asking questions he tried to answer with patience. "Granddaddy, why are you on news?" one asked. He smiled softly, brushing the child's hair back. "Because sometimes, baby, the truth needs to be heard loud enough for everyone to listen." At the courthouse, Derek Walsh sat alone in his cell, awaiting sentencing. Gone was the crisp uniform, the badge, and the swagger that had once shielded him from accountability. Now he wore the same orange jumpsuit as the men he had arrested, some of them unjustly. He thought about the years he had believed himself untouchable, the countless times he had smirked at complaints filed by nobodies. But here, stripped of his power, he realized too late that every nobody had a voice, and one of them had toppled him. The sentencing hearing drew another packed courtroom. Reporters lined the hallways, and community members filled the benches again. This time, though, the energy was different, less anxious, more resolute. People wanted to see the full measure of justice. When the judge entered, the room fell into stillness. Derek was led in, his hands cuffed, his face pale. Henry sat. In the months following Derek Walsh's sentencing, Birmingham seemed to hum with a different rhythm. It wasn't that racism had disappeared. No, the shadows of prejudice were still there, as they always had been. But something had shifted in the way people carried themselves. A quiet pride, a stubborn refusal to bow low. Henry Thompson's story had struck a chord, and the echo of it traveled farther than even he had imagined. National news outlets continued to revisit his case, often with clips of his calm, measured testimony in court. A man who could have broken under the weight of humiliation had instead stood tall and spoken the truth. That image, an elderly black man refusing to be silenced, was shared across television screens, social media feeds, and news articles. People found hope in it. Henry, though, never let the attention swell his head. He moved through his days, as he always had, tending his small garden, attending church on Sundays, walking hand in hand with his grandchildren to the corner store. Yet his home began to fill with letters from strangers across the country. Some came from young men behind bars, thanking him for showing that even the powerless could be heard. Others came from elderly women who told him that his courage reminded them of battles they had fought decades earlier during the civil rights movement. Teachers sent him notes from students who had written essays about his dignity, about how his story gave them strength. One letter in particular stood out. It was written in careful cursive, the kind that spoke of an older hand. "Mr. Thompson," it began, "I am a 76-year-old black woman who has lived my whole life believing that no one cared what happened to people like us. But when I saw you stand in that courtroom, steady and unshaken, I cried. You gave me back something I thought I had lost, the belief that our voices matter. Thank you." Henry read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper. He placed it gently in a drawer. This is the extraordinary story of Henry Thompson, a 73-year-old black man in Birmingham whose life took a shocking turn when he was robbed by Officer Derek Walsh, a racist cop who thought he could steal from an elderly man without consequences. But what Walsh didn't know was that the FBI had marked every single bill as part of a corruption sting. What began as humiliation, an old man stripped of his money and dignity, turned into one of the most remarkable cases of justice in recent memory. The FBI swooped in, catching Walsh red-handed. In court, Henry stood tall, refusing to let age or fear silence him. His testimony was steady, powerful, and unforgettable, echoing the pain and resilience of generations who had fought before him. The trial exposed not just one bad cop, but a culture of arrogance and abuse. Derek Walsh, once untouchable, was sentenced to prison. Henry, instead of sinking into bitterness, chose a higher road. He became a voice of dignity, hope, and resilience. His calm strength inspired students, activists, and ordinary citizens across the country. From speaking at universities to mentoring teenagers in his church, Henry transformed his personal suffering into a beacon of guidance. His words, "Asterisk, they tried to steal my dignity, but dignity is not for sale, asterisk," resonated everywhere. Walsh faded into obscurity behind prison walls. But Henry's legacy lived on in the letters he received, the young lives he influenced, and the powerful reminder he left behind. Justice bends only if we push it, and dignity, once defended, can never be stolen. This story is not just about crime and punishment. It's about courage, resilience, and the unbreakable dignity of Black life.